Welcome back to NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. I'm Lane Nordlund. Since 1968, the Public Lands Council has advocated on behalf of livestock producers who graze on federal lands. And today, over 20,000 ranchers run cattle and sheep on nearly 250 million acres of land managed by the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. Here to talk about the importance of unique challenges of public lands ranching is Wyoming native Kaitlynn Glover, Executive Director of the Public Lands Council and NCBA's Natural Resources. Kaitlynn, thanks for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, of course, to start things off, could you just give a brief overview of the history of public lands grazing here in the United States?
Sure. Well, the history of grazing is as long as the history of the country itself and even before our establishment. Grazing is an integral tool in land management and forest management. But really the way we know grazing today began in the 1930s with the enactment of the Taylor Grazing Act. Now, it's important to remember that even though Congress passed and the President enacted the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934, the history of the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service goes back to the late 1800s, and even the BLM's history goes back to the early 1800s. So this concept of federal engagement in public land management, public lands grazing has been around for quite some time. Now, over the years, since 1934, the Taylor Grazing Act has been evolved and changed through rules and regulations and even new bills passed in Congress. So the way we see grazing implemented today across federal lands is really a mix of what has evolved over time, those balances, those assessments. And the current scenario is a result of this change in management about 20 years ago during what we would call range reform, right? Many of us remember what that was like and how contentious it was. And it's so important and so timely, not only during this part of the year, during these months of the year for cattle and for sheep, but also because the Trump administration has started a process to revise those rules, to update those rules, bring them into current times and update them with current tools. So there's lots more context there, but that's really what we think about when we talk about public lands grazing, here in May 2020.
Kaitlynn, in the time of COVID-19, we are hearing a lot about USDA and news from the Small Business Administration, but the Department of Interior really plays a critical role in food and fiber production here in the U.S. What are some of the issues the Interior Department has been addressing recently, and could you talk more about how important that relationship that you have with the Department of Interior, you and your staff in Washington, D.C. as well?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the end of that question, and those relationships are critical. The Department of the Interior it houses a number of bureaus: the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and so our relationships with them and with those bureaus is incredibly important. Of course, Forest Service is housed outside of the Department of the Interior, and so that takes some coordination. Those relationships are incredibly important as we move through any normal grazing season. Of course, this has not been a normal grazing season because of COVID-19, of coronavirus, and so when we talk about the adaptations that have needed to happen, the first bit of relationship got us through the door, got us access to those officials to say that these are the priorities of public lands grazers, of public lands ranchers, and these are the immediate needs that need to be met. Our first focus was access to allotments, making sure that folks could turn out on time and make sure that they had a timely place to put their cows and their sheep. The second part of that, of course, is as we move through those considerations, is wildfire season. And wildfire season will be upon us, or is upon us, more earlier than probably we would like it to be. And so having those conversations, making sure that those guidance documents filter from Washington down to the ground is incredibly important. And because of our relationships, because of our access here, we're able to make sure that our requests are included and those guidance documents are issued in a timely manner.
Kaitlynn, you brought up addressing those challenges that could face producers as we begin to turn out on those grazing allotments here this summer, but you also mentioned wildfire season, and the latest drought monitors show a lot of dry areas in the West and the Pacific Northwest. What are some challenges that we may see when it comes to COVID-19 and making sure that there are men and women able to fight these fires if they do occur this summer?
The predictive modeling that the National Interagency Fire Center put out as well. When we look at May, we look at June, but then by July of this year, a significant portion of the West is in that above normal risk potential for wildfires. Now, fire, of course, is a natural part of any ecosystem management. That's normal. But what we see is the buildup of those fine fuels that turn them from wildfires into catastrophic wildfires. That intensity and that speed is really the concern. Of course, all of that is a concern in a normal year, like all of these other things. But in the age of coronavirus, PLC has been working with the department and with the Forest Service to make sure that the seasonal personnel who are the core of most of these fire crews have the training that they're able to do this safely. Because in any scenario, we want to make sure that these men and women are safe on those fire lines. And in order to do that, to make sure that we have training, to make sure that we have mobile resources for both our fire crews, but also for our ranchers, and make sure that we have a strategy moving forward for deployment of those resources. Air quality is a discussion during fire season every year. And so this is a great opportunity for grazers to show their value. In any year, the grazing is valuable, but it helps to mitigate some of the smoke concerns that are even more concerning this year with coronavirus and those respiratory conditions.
Kaitlynn, thank you so much for joining us here today and giving us an update and an overview of the role that public lands ranchers play here in the United States.
Thanks for having me.
To find out more about the public lands ranching industry here in the United States and to keep up to date on all of these issues, just visit the website publiclandscouncil.org.